Released in early 1975, Young Americans, the album and the song, broke David Bowie out as a major star in the U.S. The lyrics were inspired by those long, wordy songs about the lovable misfits who inhabit Bruce Springsteen's first two albums. David was an early fan of the boss. That frantic saxophone is an up-and-coming young hotshot named David Sanborn. The backing vocals are arranged and sung on by another relative unknown at the time, Luther Vandross. Young Americans name checks Caddies and Chryslers and Ford Mustangs, remembers your President Nixon and the bills you have to pay. It starts out feeling arch, even a bit cynical, but it's really full of empathy for its main characters. Out there in a difficult world, holding out for what they really wanted, waiting for that one damn song that can make me break down and cry. The album was a smash, his first million seller in the US, and it spun off two hit singles, The Title Cut and David's first number one in America, Fame, co-written with John Lennon. It boosted his back catalog too, but David did not tour in support of Young Americans. Now, strange because David was a touring, performing machine in those years. He was understandably weary of the road, but there was more than that going on. Upon the album's release, he decided to part ways with Tony DeFries and Main Man Management. That kicked off a bitter legal fight, and David Bowie came out in second place. DeFries sunk his claws deep into him. The settlement gave DeFries a generous payout for everything Bowie had done up to that point, and 16% of future earnings for 7 years, through the end of 1982. Records, touring, merch, publishing, all of it. David was so distraught, he wept when he read the terms. In the wake of that debacle, David split New York City in early 1975 and headed to L.A. A year before that, in London, during the Diamond Dogs recording sessions, David was turned on to cocaine. It's the drug of choice for workaholics, and that's our David. You want to keep going all through the night and into the next day. Well, cocaine works great for that. Until it doesn't. In London and New York, he did stuff that was maybe one notch above street coke, provided by hangers-on and musician buddies. But out in L.A., David found a new connection who had a line on pharmaceutical-grade cocaine. His dependency escalated dramatically into full-blown addiction. He stayed holed up at a Bel Air mansion he shared with another party animal, Deep Purple bassist Glenn Hughes. David partied, copped extra supplies, and partied some more. In his own telling, he whipsawed between near-suicidal depression and manic paranoia. He lived on copious amounts of high-grade blow, milk, and hot peppers. His regal, handsome features became pale and drawn. His 5'10" build went from slender to skeletal.
Return of the thin white duke, throwing darts in lovers' eyes.
Late spring of 1975, the director Nicholas Roge reached out. He wanted to cast David in the lead role for a sci-fi fantasy film, The Man Who Fell to Earth. Filming was on location in New Mexico and scheduled to begin in July. He traveled by train across the American Southwest, raiding on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. David was cast as Thomas Jerome Newton, an alien who comes to Earth in search of water for his dying planet. Nicholas Roge was one of those directors who did wonders on modest budgets. It's a visually compelling film, beautifully shot. What would a bright, sensitive, and thoroughly alien being think and feel and do if he fell alone out of the sky and into today's world? The answer unwinds as a calm and surreal parable that examines big ideas, capitalism and consumerism, addiction, isolation, and identity. David cleaned up out there in the desert, dialed back his drug-taking. He started eating again and filled out noticeably. His castmates recall him as a bit aloof, but always cordial and polite, serious about the work. It was a good performance that earned favorable reviews. The Man Who Fell to Earth was a minor hit at the time, and over the years, it's become a cult classic. Back in Los Angeles in the fall, David went back to work on music and fell back into a druggy Hollywood haze. Late September of 1975, he booked time at a new facility, Cherokee Studios, at Melrose and Van Ness, right down the street from the Paramount lot. The recording studio was natural to David. He may not have had an engineer's understanding of it, but he knew where shit was and got how it worked. To this point in his career, he had always worked quickly. But this time, David stretched it out, 10 weeks, to compose and record his 10th studio album, Station to Station.
It's not the side effects of the cocaine. I'm thinking that it must be long. It's too late to be grateful. It's too late to be late again. It's too late to be hateful. The European pattern is near. I must be only one in a million.
This podcast is intended to be education and commentary. It will discuss adult themes and may use coarse language. Pantheon Podcasts presents Rock and Roll Archaeology with host Christian Swain. Music, culture, technology, and rock and roll. And now, on with the show.
Hello, gentle space boys and lady stardusts. Richard, Jerry, and I welcome you to the next installment in the Rock and Archaeology Project. You know, the little podcast that decided to tell the entire history of music, culture, and technology in the late 20th century. We've been at it for 10 years now. 2015 makes it a decade. The going is slow, but the destination is worth it, right? Of course, you can let us know directly by telling us so, and publicly. Step 1 is the website, rockandrollarchaeology.com. And yes, we made it hard. Smart people only, like yourselves, you got to use the proper English spelling of AEO for archaeology. It's the first test, and congrats, you have passed. From there, all the socials are found to tell us where it's at. If you love us so much that you'd like to help, well, then smash the support button at the top of the web page. A small Patreon donation gets you ad-free versions, a little more, and there are some nice upgrades. You can grab some TeePublic swag as well. Of course, you can also support us by subscribing and leaving us reviews on your favorite podcast app. You'd be surprised how much that affects the algorithms that determine if more people get to hear us. Yes, you can be your very own algorithm and just tell all your friends, and please do that. Let's not forget about our partnership with rocksbackpages.com. Now that we are firmly in the 1970s, RBP has proven invaluable in the research phase of putting these shows together. Having all these music articles from the golden age of music journalism in one place really is gold for us. Make sure you visit them and see what the fuss is all about. Okay, public service announcement. We want to let students and educators know this. If you would like a PDF of any of the show notes, the best way to get them is through our Patreon page. So another reason to take a look over at Patreon. There's a free membership tier, and we post the notes right there for everyone, usually in the first comment underneath. If you can't find a particular one, message us through Patreon, and we'll see that you get it. All right, let's get the first words from our sponsors out of the way. Okay, we are back. This time out, we will stay in the UK, mostly. We're going from the heady philosophical, mythological world of Prague in the last episode to her fashionista little brother with the snotty nose and the devil-may-care attitude, who is clearly focused on more earthly pursuits. The world of glam, or glitter, is the subject. And like the Prague episode, the UK glam era is one of our all-time favorite periods of rock and roll as well. But this music wasn't for playing D&D exactly, but for another type of fantasy that people play. Now, like the mods, it was small and short-lived, and never really made it big in America at the time, at least not in the sexualized, gender-bending flavors favored by the UK. America wasn't ready for that, but we did take a cue in a couple of instances and took it over the top in other ways. Of course, looming over the glam and glitter era is the singular one, Mr. David Bowie. Perhaps not the originator exactly, but that wasn't going to stop his obsession of becoming its main man and then transcending the movement he helped to create by destroying his own scary monsters along the way. All right, darlings, give me your hands because you're wonderful. So let's get to the glitter, the glam. We give you episode 26, Turn and Face the Strange.
She's my woman of gold, and she's not very old.
We'll start by saying we're going to be very elastic and generous with our definitions. Glam rock is many things to many people. Said it before, and here we go again. Genre labels like glam or punk or metal or prog and so on are just loose shorthand, a convenient way to talk about music and audiences. Now, this is a good moment to pause and cite our main sources too. We recommend the hell out of the first book. It is really quite something. The author is Simon Reynolds. The title is Shock and Awe. It was published in 2016 to good reviews and strong sales. Now, Shock and Awe is written from the perspective that we like best, that we shoot for ourselves, that of a smart, engaged, and well-informed fan. Second up is Paul Trinka's 2011 biography of David Bowie titled Starman. Unsurprisingly, there are a bunch of good books out there about David. We went with Trinka because he wrote a bio of Brian Jones that we also liked a lot and used for episodes 10 and 19. Lots of other sources in the show notes, plus a Spotify playlist, so please go check that out. Okay, so one way to define glam is to talk about what it's not. In no small part, glam rock was a reaction against the complexity and pretension of psychedelic rock and psychedelia's younger brother, progressive rock, which was our subject in the previous episode. Glam rock ditched the ponderous for the punchy, adopted the straightforward song forms of the late 50s and early 60s, short, focused, energetic. Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin famously refused to issue singles. The artsy, serious long-play album was their format of choice. Glam artists unapologetically chased hit singles. In the early 70s, they brought the 3-minute record back from the dead. Really. Glam songs often had elements of teeny bopper and bubblegum pop, but with a modern twist. Glam embraced all the latest advances in recording techniques. So, big drums, layered guitars, double-tracked vocals, synthesizers, overdubs, and orchestration, sound effects galore. Glam also flipped the script on the political ideals and communal ethos of hippie-era rock. Glam promised personal escape into perpetual fantasy, a moon-age daydream of fame and fun and outrageous freaky-deaky individuality. Smile on your brother, join hands, and change the world? Nah, mate, we're past that now. Keep your electric eye on me, babe. Put your ray gun to my head. Authenticity is the currency of folk and country music, and the rockers who are inspired and influenced by those roots. Bob Dylan and the band, Joni Mitchell and Neil Young, all those LA singer-songwriters and southern rockers like the Allman Brothers or Leonard Skinner. Glam mostly rejected this natural, wholesome aesthetic. Glam's currency was theatricality and spectacle, the unnatural and the plastic. Some artists from the heyday of glam, notably Roxy Music and David Bowie, strongly hinted at what we now call postmodernism. Coy and self-aware, edging over into cynicism, unafraid to blur the line between reality and artifice, or better yet, just obliterate that line. Something else about glam that Simon Reynolds discussed, and this one really made our antenna twitch. With the perspective gained from 50 years, we can see that glam shows up regularly. First in the early 70s, and it resurfaced in the 80s. We saw another revival in the early 2000s, and don't look now, here it comes again in 2025. Reynolds observes, correctly in our view, this is not mere coincidence. Glam principles become ascendant in pop culture when politics moves to the right. Starting in the early 70s of Nixon and Heath, then resurfacing in the 80s of Reagan and Thatcher. We see it again in the early aughts, the post 9/11 era. And we'll call it right here as we enter 2025, as we nervously watch the latest crude, ugly lurch towards fascism, not just in America, but around the world. Watch for new glam-inspired artists to emerge. Bands like The Struts or Adam Lambert, who've been doing it for a while now, and newcomers like Måneskin or Starcrawler are going to find new fans. We'll revisit these predictions in a year or two and see how we did. Anyhow, Reynolds explains further. Glam rock, then and now, is a movement rooted in disillusionment. Glam isn't about collective hope or change. It's about escaping into fantasy, rejecting the harshness of reality, replacing it with glitter and spectacle. Turn and face the strange. But darlings, first, we must raise a dazzling middle finger to banality and futility. 70s glam was mostly a UK phenomenon. There were some American acts, notably our favorite shock rocker Alice Cooper and the proto-punks Iggy Pop and Lou Reed. We'll mention the New York Dolls, who were a lot more style than substance, at least in our view. They might have been something, but drugs and infighting derailed them after just one album. And another act from the same New York scene, Kiss. We find Kiss's music to be standard forgettable crotch rock. They dressed it up with, it must be said, some truly advanced glam-inspired stagecraft. Costumes and makeup, lighting and pyrotechnics, the entire kitchen sink, and then another kitchen sink just in case you missed the first one. They put on big, stupid fun, and that's a very glam rock thing to do. They also adopted the glam ethos of relentless self-promotion. I mean, really, Kiss did that part of it better than anybody. We don't know if music students should study Kiss, but a business and marketing major would have much to learn here. So would a theater tech major, come to think of it. To be a fan, to be a member of the Kiss Army, is to be a consumer of Kiss merchandise. Never for a moment have they pretended otherwise. Example. About a third of their album offerings, about half their overall sales, are recycled compilations and greatest hits packages. But do you know who else did that? And did that a lot? David Bowie. And nobody calls him shallow or dumb. Anyway, the devoted denizens of the Kiss Army all seem to understand. This is the deal, the price of their devotion. Like a similar fandom, pro wrestling fans, the Kiss Army is invested in what promoters call the kayfabe. They know the body slams are not real. They know the outcome is preordained. It's kayfabe. They know, and they don't care. They just open their wallets for it. Why? Because it's fun. So, how does one get from a discussion about the death of idealism and the concordant rise of the postmodern aesthetic to I want to rock and roll all night and party every day? Alice Cooper, that's how. In 1973, not long after he joined Kiss, guitarist Ace Frehley and his bandmates went to see Alice Cooper on the $1 Billion Babies tour. In a 2021 interview, Ace said that was it for him and the other guys in Kiss. They knew what they wanted to do. Following up on the chart success of Billion Dollar Babies, the initial idea for a live show was Alice at the Palace, a long-term residency at the storied theater at Broadway and 47th Street in New York City. That plan fell apart, but rather than abandon it, they doubled down and took their theater of horror vision on the road. The set was a chrome-laden, two-tiered stage complete with statues, mannequins, and a towering Egyptian figure behind the drum kit. Enter Alice, strutting on stage in ripped, grimy leotards and thigh-high leopard boots. It was shock rock mayhem, easily the most theatrical show ever to that point. Baby dolls met their doom at Alice's sword. Mannequins got way too much attention. A mad dentist drilled Alice's teeth in a freaky dance of pain and pleasure. And of course, the climactic bit, Alice getting beheaded by a guillotine, only to return in a new costume, head attached. Then he would lead the band in beating up a Nixon impersonator during School's Out. As they went from town to town, Alice would typically speak for the band when the local news media came calling. And they came calling. But the story in the nightly news over and over was, he's just a regular guy. The twisted, outrageous stage persona was exactly that, a stage persona, a character. Alice politely answered questions and came across as smart and funny. He had a steady girlfriend and didn't chase groupies, liked his beer but didn't take hard drugs. His favorite pastime was golf, for fuck's sake. Off stage, the guy was basically normal sauce. Well, the 70s rock and roll version of normal sauce. Overall, glam didn't really catch on big in America. Over in the UK, T-Rextasy was the second coming of Beatlemania. T-Rex was that big in England, 11 top 10 singles in a row across a 2.5-year span. But only one hit single in the States, Bang a Gong. Mott the Hoople and Slade were great bands. We still don't completely understand why Slade wasn't massive in the States. Those guys were clever and fun, and they rocked hard. Mott the Hoople the same. They did very well in the British Isles, but never made it past mid-level in the US. At best, they could headline small halls and open up at festivals and arena shows. But America's homegrown version of glam rock, or shock rock, or whatever you want to call it, Alice Cooper, was huge. Platinum albums, top 10 singles. At the time, the Billion Dollar Babies Roadshow was the highest-grossing rock tour in history. In the late 60s and early 70s, openly gay public figures were few and far between in America. As such, the English-American novelist Christopher Isherwood had a real impact on the emerging gay rights movement. Through his candid writing and through Living Out and Proud, again rare at the time, Isherwood challenged stereotypes and brought visibility to LGBTQ experiences. Isherwood is best known for Goodbye to Berlin. It's a semi-autobiographical novella inspired by his time as a pleasure-seeking expatriate living in 1930s Berlin. In this freewheeling milieu, Isherwood embraces his gay identity and honed his skills as a writer, becoming, in his words, a camera capturing the world around him.
I'm a camera with its shutter open, quite passive, recording, not thinking. Recording the man shaving at the window opposite and the woman in the kimono washing her hair.
The novel's characters, like the cabaret singer and call girl Sally Bowles, are desperate hedonists, clinging to pleasures for the moment to stave off despair. As the story unfolds, the growing threat of Nazism stalks their lives, getting closer and closer. In 1933, Adolf Hitler cemented his hold on political power in Germany. Isherwood fled. In January of 1939, he immigrated to America. In 1946, Christopher Isherwood became a naturalized American citizen. He settled in Hollywood, taught English Lit at several different Southern California colleges, and continued to write novels and the occasional screenplay. In 1951, a stage adaptation of Goodbye Berlin, titled I Am a Camera, was a modest success, and a film version followed in 1955. In 1966, I Am a Camera was adapted into the Tony Award-winning stage musical Cabaret. In 1972, the film version of Cabaret, directed by the great Bob Fosse, starring Liza Minnelli and Joel Grey, was released. A little aside, Ms. Minnelli won the Oscar for Best Actress, and Mr. Grey won both the Tony in the Broadway version and the Oscar for his role as the Master of Ceremonies. Cabaret was edgy and groundbreaking, and it was a smash, critically acclaimed, and one of the most popular films of the year.
Cabaret is drenched in the sexiest kind of cynicism and decadent despair. It is Nero's fiddle, scraping and squawking in the 20th century.
That's Peter Bradshaw from a 2013 review published in the London Guardian. At the 1973 Academy Awards, Cabaret won 8 Oscars. It was the first Oscar-winning film ever to feature an LGBTQ main character. Cabaret was famously edged out by The Godfather for Best Picture that year, but it still holds the record for the most Oscars won by a film that did not win Best Picture.
Holly came from Miami, FLA, hitchhiked away across USA, plucked her eyebrows on the way, shaved her legs, and then he was a she. She says, hey babe, take a walk on the wild side. Said, hey honey, take a walk on the wild side.
Like Berlin back in Isherwood's day, New York City, circa 1969, had a decadent reputation. You could let your freak flag fly in New York, it was said. But the reality on the ground was far more difficult and dangerous for queer and trans people. There wasn't just a social price, it was illegal to be gay. Just talking about it with a vice cop would get you arrested. Job and housing discrimination were common. There was no recourse and no legal way to fight back. Bars and restaurants wouldn't serve you. The police would arrest you for wearing, quote, non-gender conforming, unquote, clothing. Safe spaces were few and far between. One of them was the Stonewall Inn, where queer and trans people could dance, kiss, and just be. Organized crime families owned and operated Stonewall, along with the majority of the city's gay bars and clubs. This unlikely but mutual beneficial association lasted well into the 1980s. The mob paid the cops to look the other way. But there were plenty of homophobic fanatics serving in the NYPD. They would pocket the bribes and then turn around and hassle queer folk anyway. Near closing time, on June 28, 1969, yet another raid hit the Stonewall. The bar was packed. The cops arrived with a search warrant in hand, ready to seize evidence and make arrests. Police supervisors ordered everyone out onto the sidewalk, but things didn't go as planned. By the hundreds, curious bystanders joined in, drawn by the commotion. In the exact words of the police report published at nycop.com, tensions rose. The crowd outside became restless, edging closer to chaos. Interesting use of the passive voice there. So those tensions just rose and things turned chaotic and all that just occurred in a vacuum without any provocation. Right, officers? Right. Inside the Stonewall, as police tried to make arrests, a wave of resistance swept through the bar. Then someone, rumored to be Marsha P. Johnson, threw a glass, shattering the mirror behind the bar. It sounded like a shot went off. Outside the Stonewall, the pent-up rage exploded. The The sidewalk crowd became an angry, shouting mob. Someone threw a burning trash can through the front window. Inside, the cops doused the fire, barricaded the front door, and retreated into the interior of the stone wall. They handcuffed their detainees to pipes in the bathrooms and looked for another way out. The back door was welded shut. They were trapped. Eventually, a tactical team showed up and forcibly dispersed the crowd, and the officers trapped inside made their way out uninjured. But the unrest spread like wildfire up and down Christopher Street and continued for 5 more days. The Stonewall Uprising made national news and ignited a movement. No more hiding, no more silence. Marsha P. Johnson and others founded a new activist group, the Gay Liberation Front. The GLF started marching and protesting openly, demanding respect and rights for LGBTQ people. Stonewall marked the turning point when and where queer and trans folks finally said enough and meant it. 1 year later, on June 28, 1970, the first ever Pride Parade was held on Christopher Street. A few record producers grace our music collections with multiple entries from multiple artists. In past episodes, we've talked about Tom Dowd, George Martin, Clint Johns. Tony Visconti, who produced Bang a Gong and every other T-Rex record, is another one. Let's meet Tony.
In listening, you'll realize that there's no Visconti sound. I'm not someone who comes in and says, we'll do it my way. Producing should be a protective occupation. You're there to make sure an artist's ideal sound is recorded the way they would like to hear it.
Raised in Brooklyn, Tony Visconti grew up a musical prodigy. By the time he was a teenager, he was a gifted multi-instrumentalist. In 1968, Tony was working an entry-level position for the Richmond Organization, or TRO, a musical publishing firm with offices in New York and London. He made friends with a bloke named Denny Cordell, who worked in a similar position at Island Records. Denny brought Tony in to assist on sessions for the jazz singer Georgie Fame. Turned out Tony could write charts, so Denny didn't have to pay extra for an arranger. Denny Cordell liked that. Tony relocated to London, and right away started working with one of Cordell's recent discoveries, a psychedelic folk duo who called themselves Tyrannosaurus Rex. They were fronted by an elfin, warbly-voiced singer named Mark Bolan, all of 5'5" tall, with pretty features and a big mop of curly hair. In Tony's estimation, a raw and unpolished musician, but Mark had that it factor, a watchable quality, charisma. Here's a future rock star, Tony reckoned. Their first of 11 Tony Visconti-produced albums was called, okay, you ready for this? My people were fair and had sky in their hair, but now they're content to wear stars on their brows. John Anderson would be proud. That gives you a feel for Tyrannosaurus Rex. They enjoyed modest success in the UK for 3 years and 4 albums. One day, out on tour, Tony heard Mark noodling on an electric guitar and encouraged him to play it full time. For the 5th album, they brought in a studio drummer, and Tony played bass. Mark's cosmic musings were set to a tougher, leaner sound, and they shortened up the name to T-Rex. The 6th album, Electric Warrior, released in September of 1971, was when it finally came together. Simon Reynolds writes that Electric Warrior took the ponderousness and grit out of blues-based rock and made it playful and sexy. Lithe and succulent is how he described it. Electric Warrior shot to #1 in the UK the week it was released and stayed there for months.
Oh, girl, I'm just a cheapster for your love. I said, girl, I'm just a vampire for your love. And I'm gonna suck you.
All right, let's take a short break and do a little business. So stay right here. We'll be right back. We introduced David Bowie in episode 18, the first of 2 chapters in our big sprawling account of 1969. Find it on the website and the usual podcast feeds. David entered our orbit when we discussed the U.S. space program and specifically the first moon landing in July of that year. Here's what we said. The BBC used David Bowie's Space Oddity as bumper music during its coverage of Apollo 11. David had no idea until he turned on his telly to watch it. David's tune describes not a space oddity, it's more of a space catastrophe. Your circuit's dead, there's something wrong. In the end, Major Tom embraces his lonely fate. Planet Earth is blue and there's nothing I can do, and he is left to float forever in space. We went on to note that David was a voracious reader throughout his life and early an avid fan of science fiction. The Robert Heinlein novel, Starman Jones, was a favorite. David was a precocious lad of just 7 when he read that one. Point being, opening David Bowie's story with Space Oddity is fitting and proper, but we'll go back a little now and tell some of the origin story.
Oh, yeah. And my time was running wild, a million dead-end streets.
David Robert Jones was born in the South London suburb of Brixton on January 8, 1947. He was the only child of Haywood and Margaret Jones, John and Peggy to friends and family. David had a maternal stepbrother, Terry Burns. As a young woman, Peggy Burns was vivacious, happy-go-lucky, and a real beauty. David and Terry both got their good looks from their mum. Peggy was working as a fashion model when she had a one-night stand with a married man. Terry Burns was born out of wedlock on Guy Fawkes Day, November 5, 1937. Peggy left Terry in the care of his maternal grandmother, also named Margaret. The elder Margaret was humiliated that her daughter had a child out of wedlock, so she directed that shame and anger at young Terry.
Time may change me, but I can't trace time. I said that time may change me, but I can't trace time.
There was a strong family history of schizophrenia. 3 of Peggy's 5 siblings were diagnosed and treated for it. One was actually lobotomized for it. A savage medical practice that endured well into the 1960s, both in the UK and America. David Bowie and his mum both lived their entire lives morbidly fascinated by the specter of severe mental illness. We think it's very possible that David developed his many personas throughout his career as a way of dealing with latent schizophrenia. There is a genetic component to it, and that's been known for a long time. But more recent studies show that emotional abuse during childhood, especially from a caregiver, is a much stronger predictor when it comes to adult-onset schizophrenia. Terry Burns never had a chance. Terry got out from under his abusive grandmother and joined the Jones family when he was 10, not long after David's birth. It wasn't much of an improvement. John Jones was like a lot of middle-class British men of his generation, reserved, standoffish, kind of a tight ass, if we're being honest. He was always a solid provider, and when it counted, he turned out to be a caring dad to his young son, David. When it became clear their son wanted to pursue a career in the arts, it was John who set Peggy straight. "We'll support the lad, and that's that," he insisted. But John was cold to his stepson, Terry. The favoritism was obvious to David from a very young age. He hated it even more because he felt powerless to do anything about it. From the time he was able to walk and talk, David loved his big brother, Terry, fiercely and unconditionally. schoolboy, young David Jones showed a strong aptitude for the arts. His dance teacher told John and Peggy their 8-year-old son had a highly advanced sense of movement. Around that time, Terry was called up for national service. The following year, the Jones family relocated from Brixton to Bromley, an outer borough of Greater London, just a short train ride away. At Bromley Technical High School, David made 3 lifelong friends. The first was a younger boy, Peter Frampton, 3 years behind David, already known for being a hotshot guitarist and best in the whole school. Peter's dad, Owen, was head of the art department at Bromley. Owen took young David Jones under his wing. Owen Frampton was one of those teachers. He was a friend of the art kids, to the misfits and the dreamers. He pushed, he encouraged, and most of all, he listened. Owen helped many of his students, including David, land jobs in advertising and commercial art, or gain admission to art college. Jeff McCormick was another Bromley student. Under his stage name, Warren Peace, he worked with David off and on for decades as a singer, keyboardist, and arranger. And then there was George Underwood. George and the Dragons, featuring David Jones on sax, opened for Peter Frampton's band at a Bromley school dance. It went well enough, but David and George fancied the same girl. "I don't go around hitting people, I promise you," George said years later in a CNN interview. But when he heard David boasting about his date the next day, George just saw red. He reached out and popped 15-year-old David in the left eye. Popped him good, put him in the hospital. The pupil of David's left eye was left permanently dilated. In later years, it was sometimes mistaken for heterochromia iridium, 2 different eye colors. Nope, it was just George Underwood's jealous fist. David didn't stay mad at George. "I did rather have it coming," he would tell interviewers in later years. Through their shared passion for Americana and rock and roll, these 4 schoolboy chums from Bromley formed bonds that profoundly shaped their adult lives and careers. Terry came back from serving in the Royal Air Force about the same time David started at Bromley Tech. Terry tried so hard. He tried to fit in, tried school, tried to stick at a job, but his mental health was already slipping. The thing that gave him peace, Terry's one happiness, was sharing his love of books and jazz with his kid brother David. One night, Terry helped him sneak into a London jazz club. After the show, outside on the sidewalk, David was buzzing, electrified by what he had just seen and heard. But it only lasted a moment. As David stood by helplessly, Terry was overcome by an intense schizophrenic episode, complete with vivid, terrifying hallucinations. Once he was able to speak again, he told David, "I've been having them for a while now."
Lay me place and take me pie, I'm starving for me gravy. Leave my shoes and door unlocked, I might just slip away. Just for the day. Please come away. Just for the day. Please come away.
There is a semi-famous photo of a young Lou Reed standing in a brick vestibule right next to the Stonewall Inn at 53 Christopher Street in Greenwich Village. But Lou Reed was performing in Philadelphia with the Velvet Underground on the evening of June 27, 1969. So no, he didn't live right over the Stonewall when the uprising began in the early morning hours of June 28th. He did rent a flat above the bar, but that was a couple of years later. Around the same time, Lou Reed started working with David Bowie. In November of 1970, David Bowie released his 3rd studio album, The Man Who Sold the World. David moved off trying to be a willowy folk singer. Songs like Width of a Circle and Black Country Rock were a decisive shift to a lean and tough guitar-driven rock sound. This is also where Mick Ronson comes into David's orbit, and Mick had a lot to do with the new direction. Fresh off his success with T-Rex, Tony Visconti came on board to play bass and co-produce, but he didn't get along with David's new manager, Tony DeFries. So Visconti left when the album wrapped and didn't come back to formally work with David until the Young Americans sessions 4 very eventful years later. We talked about Tony DeFries early on, and we were less than complimentary. So it's only fair to say this. Tony DeFries got it done for David, guided him from promising mid-level act to a global superstar in the space of 4 years. After taking David on at main man management, DeFries got him out from under all of his previous contracts and management deals. On the strength of good sales for the man who sold the world, he convinced RCA to sign David to a multi-year recording and distribution deal. With a push from David, DeFries brought Mick Ronson, Mott the Hoople, and Iggy Pop on to the roster at Main Man. In the fall of 1971, David went to New York to sign the RCA deal. He paid a visit to the factory, Andy Warhol's workspace, to meet the famous artist and auteur. It was a painfully awkward encounter, a classic case of never meet your heroes. When asked about it in later years, David liked to recycle a joke he heard from Lou Reed. "This is an Andy Warhol doll. Wind it up and it does absolutely nothing."
And he said, well, I don't know why he's doing music. This music's as bad as his painting. I thought, I'm going to like this. So I'd never heard anything quite like it. It was a revelation to me.
And so it influenced your own writing and music in some way?
I think, yes, tentatively, it influenced what I was to do for the next few years. I don't think it outrightly, I don't think I ever felt that I was in a position to become a Velvet's clone. But there were elements of what Lou was doing that I thought were just unavoidably right for both the times and for where music was going. One of it was the use of cacophony as background noise, and to create a kind of an ambience that had been hitherto unknown in rock, I think.
That's David, taken from the 1998 PBS documentary Lou Reed, Rock and Roll Heart. Even casual Bowie fans know he was an early and ardent admirer of the Velvet Underground. Waiting for the Man off the first Velvet's album was a staple in his live shows for decades. Meeting Andy was a weird disappointment, but David carried on. He asked a mutual friend to set up a meeting with Lou Reed, dinner, drinks, and a show, walking distance from Andy Warhol's factory at the legendary Rockstar Hangout, Max's Kansas City. The two got on famously, as they say, and agreed to work together. The following summer, David Bowie and Mick Ronson co-produced Transformer, Lou Reed's second solo album after leaving the Velvets.
Satellite of love, satellite of love, satellite of love, satellite of. Satellite's gone way up to Mars.
With tracks like Walk on the Wild Side, Perfect Day, and that one, Satellite of Love, Transformer catapulted Lou Reed from cult hero to major star. A lot of the books and articles we've read cite Transformer as one of the key albums of the 70s glam period. Just our personal take, but Transformer doesn't really hit us as a glam rock album, more of a singer-songwriter kind of effort. It's Lou and a bunch of session musicians. But once again, we're elastic with our definitions, and we're not going to tell anyone how they should hear or interpret Transformer. It is one of the great albums of the 1970s. We will stand on that assertion. In his book, Shock and Awe, Simon Reynolds writes that Ronson and Bowie divided up the labor. Mick was the lead musician and arranger. He played multiple instruments on most every track. That elegant string arrangement on Perfect Day is an especially fine example of Mick's work. David worked directly with Lou and kept his temperamental, drug-addled artist on task, kept things moving. David was in the middle of touring Ziggy Stardust, so it's not like he had time to mess around. The sessions at Trident Studios in London were efficient. Transformer was recorded and mixed down in under a month, and the album was released in November of 1972. Walk on the Wild Side, with its slinky bass groove played by Herbie Flowers and its sly, knowing delivery from Lou, was the lead single. A slow burner, but it rose steadily up the charts, eventually hitting top 10 in the UK and top 20 in America. In January of 1972, not long after he started hanging out with Lou Reed, David Bowie famously came out as gay in an interview published in Melody Maker magazine. It was likely a publicity gambit, David being edgy to gain attention. It wasn't the first time, and wouldn't be the last. David had a wife and a son at the time, but he openly embraced the campy, over-the-top aesthetic of the queer community. His on-stage alter ego, Ziggy Stardust, blended and blurred traditional gender norms. Just 2 years later, in '74, Bowie identified as bisexual. But in 1983, he surprised fans again by calling himself a closeted heterosexual. "I was young, I was experimenting," he told Rolling Stone magazine when asked directly about the Melody Maker interview. It's hard to know for sure about any of it, which is, of course, exactly what David intended. He wasn't trying to inform, he was seeking to provoke, to keep the world guessing. He was, especially in the 70s, a bullshitter of Shakespearean proportions. He also created some of the most fundamentally honest, authentic rock music to ever come along. He was endlessly creative and cutting edge. He also stole ideas from other artists constantly and without shame. He made some of the best recordings of the entire rock era. His influence is vast. And he also had some big-time flops, critically panned disasters that fell flat with the public too. Calculating and manipulative, he stood behind his icy, distant alter egos. He also respected and loved his audience, almost to the point of mushiness. We have our own theories about David's ever-evolving, coy and cagey answers when asked about his gender identity and or his sexual preferences. We talked about latent schizophrenia earlier, but really it probably wasn't that deep. He was being provocative, getting his name in the media. That's obvious. He admitted as much in later years. But we think he was trying to be many things in order to relate to as many fans as possible and give them a way to relate back to him. That yearning, sometimes explicit, other times implied, that longing for a connection with his fans is in so many David Bowie songs. Starman, off the Ziggy Stardust album, broke him through. Finally, after years of hits and misses, Ziggy made David a big star, and David made Ziggy a big star in the UK and Europe. And America was next. The song is a story told by two fans, lonely and reaching out to each other. "I had to phone someone, so I picked on you. Hey, that's far out, so you heard him too."
Switch on the TV, we may pick him up on channel 2. Look out your window, I can see his light. If we can sparkle, he may land tonight. Don't tell your papa, or he'll get us locked up and tight. There's a starman waiting.
July 6, 1972, the day that invented the 80s. That night, the BBC show Top of the Pops featured David Bowie in full Ziggy Stardust regalia, backed by the Spiders from Mars, playing Starman. It's a fantastic performance, and we use the fantastic here not as a hype word. We mean it quite literally. The song and the performance are the stuff of fantasy, pure products of the artist's imagination. The character of Ziggy Stardust was at least partially inspired by Iggy Pop. We're inspired by Iggy Pop too. We're fanboys. We'll talk about Iggy some more in just a bit. Now, he's the Starman, and he'd like to come and meet us, but he thinks he'd blow our minds. Back to the BBC performance. David's fifth studio album, The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, had been out for a couple of weeks in the UK. That was David's third appearance on Britain's top music show, and his first with the Spiders. Mick Ronson on guitar, Trevor Bolder on bass, and Woody Woodmansey on drums, with the session player Nicky Graham sitting in on keys. The band is miming, pretending to play their instruments to a backing track. We may be wrong about this, but it sure seems like David's lead vocal is live. In any case, it was a sensation. Like Elvis and then the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show, this broadcast of Top of the Pops grabbed the attention and fired the imagination of many a future star. Bono from U2, Robert Smith of The Cure, Susie Sue, Morrissey and Johnny Marr from The Smiths, Nick Gahan from Depeche Mode, Mick Jones of The Clash, all the guys in Duran Duran. We could keep going. Just a few of the many 80s rockers who have said their lives were changed by David Bowie on the telly on that summer night in 1972. Iconic perhaps, interesting certainly, the Starman waiting in the sky. Didn't much like it up there. You see, David Bowie hated to fly. In 1972, David toured the world in support of Ziggy Stardust, nearly 200 shows on 4 continents. Each flight was agony for him. Towards the end of that tour, on a short puddle jumper flight to the island of Cyprus, the small plane hit some bad turbulence, and that sealed it. No more flying. He loved traveling on ships and trains, though. On numerous occasions in the 70s, he crossed the Atlantic on ocean liners. It's possible he wasn't so much afraid of flying, he was just enamored of ships and trains. Bandmates who traveled with him, and some of his biographers, seem to think that. But according to his son Duncan Jones, it wasn't until 1983 that David got on a plane again. On the North American leg of the 72 tour, from February to October, he often took the train, sometimes with his guitarist and companion Mick Ronson, other times traveling solo. David took in the sights and savored the iconic names, the Texas Chief, the Coast Starlighter, the San Francisco Zephyr.
Taking you nowhere. Look at that sky, life's begun. Nights are warm and the days are young.
All right, jump ahead a bit now. Run for the shadows in these golden years. David Bowie often said he had no real memories of making Station to Station. He also said, often, that 1974 through 1976 was a period of time mostly lost to him, the worst years of his life. Station to Station came out to a lot of hype at the beginning of 1976, and it lived up to that hype. Looking back, while it may be the work of someone deeply troubled, just barely hanging on, Station to Station still shines as one of David's best albums. It's also a transitional work. In a chameleonic musical career full of dramatic changes, Station to Station stands out as David's biggest, most dramatic inflection point. In David's own words, the Berlin trilogy, Low, Heroes, and Lodger, those albums were a direct follow-on from Station to Station. It was a commercial and artistic success, but again, in his own words, David Bowie was a basket case, pushed to the edge by cocaine, exhaustion, and a creepy obsession with the occult. David wanted and needed out of L.A. The road beckoned. With 2 hit albums and 3 top 10 singles over the last 12 months, David had an opportunity to earn big playing live. Rehearsals started in January of 1976. David had already packed up his belongings. With tours in, he would settle in Europe. That much was decided. Lots of great musicians recorded and toured with David Bowie. He brought in session aces and established stars. David had a special knack, though, for finding relative unknowns with big talent and jump-starting their careers. From the Station to Station album and Isolar tour, he put together one of his strongest units, a potent mix of hotshot youngsters and established session pros. Mick Ronson left the Bowie orbit in 1973 to pursue a solo career and work with Ian Hunter of Mott the Hoople. Interesting aside, in 1974, David Bowie played lead guitar on the Diamond Dogs album for the first and only time in his long recording career. Inspired by the Rolling Stones, David came up with some pretty good stuff. Yeah, not bad at all. We're kind of glossing over 1974, but we should pause and talk about Rebel Rebel. Looking back, we can see it's the song that closes out the glam rock era for David, the era he started with Starman. Fittingly, it's a love letter to his fans. Pete Townsend was really good at this too. He didn't write songs about himself. Well, he did, but he also wrote songs about you. You Mod Kid, or now You Glam Kid, Rebel Rebel, Out There in the Crowd, or Alone at Home with Your Radio. Got your mother in a whirl, but it's all right. Your face is a mess, but you're a juvenile success.
Hot tramp, I love you so.
For young Americans, David picked up a new guitarist / sidekick, Earl Slick. Earl was joined by Carlos Alomar on guitar, George Murray on bass, and Dennis Davies on drums for the Station Station sessions. These guys were the core of what ended up being David Bowie's longest tenured backing band. Roy Bittan from the E Street Band played piano on 5 of the 6 tracks. It was Roy's first big-time session job, and he recalls it as one of the best musical experiences of his career. Earl Slick was still under contract with Tony DeFries and Main Man, so he was replaced by Stacey Hayden for the tour. Roy Bittan was committed to touring with Bruce Springsteen, so Tony Kaye, formerly of Yes, took over on keys. The Isolar tour moved from west to east, starting in Vancouver on February 2, 1976. A week later, the Thin White Duke returned to the Forum in Los Angeles for 3 nights, February 9th through the 11th. The shows were magnificent, sold out, rave reviews. In L.A., a passenger joined the tour as a backup singer and part of David's personal entourage. Late 1974, Jimmy Osterberg, Iggy Pop to the world, but David always called him Jim or Jimmy, was given a choice by a Los Angeles Superior Court judge. County jail or check into the Neuropsychiatric Institute at UCLA. Iggy had been picked up by the LAPD at the Hamburger Hamlet on Hollywood Boulevard. He was gacked on heroin, acting crazy, pissing his pants, and generally freaking out the customers and staff. Early spring of 1975, just a few days after arriving in L.A., David came to see him at the Funny Farm. Nobody visited me, Iggy recalled a few years later, but David did. Iggy Pop and David Bowie first met in New York in 1971, around the same time Lou Reed came into the picture. The Stooges had enjoyed some success, making 2 albums that sold modestly but were beloved by other artists and by rock writers. Fellow Detroit native Lester Bangs was a big booster of the Stooges. He wrote lots of glowing reviews in Cream and Rolling Stone, but it wasn't enough. They flamed out spectacularly. Because Iggy doesn't do things halfway. Over the space of just a few months, the Stooges blew every penny of a $50,000 advance from Elektra Records on heroin. While they were all nodding off one night, their equipment got stolen. Not long after that, Elektra dropped them. With a push from David Bowie, Tony DeFries brought the Stooges into main man management. They rebranded slightly. Now they were Iggy Pop and the Stooges. DeFries convinced Columbia Records to take a chance on them. He flew Iggy and his new writing partner, guitarist James Williamson, over to London. They were so scruffy and disreputable looking that DeFries had to intervene personally before customs would even allow them in the country. They didn't click with any of the studio players they met in London, a bunch of sissies, according to James. They convinced Main Man to buy plane tickets for the original Stooges, guitarist Ron Ashton, who moved over to bass, and drummer Scott Ashton. They spent 6 months in London writing and rehearsing. Early 1973, they released Raw Power, an aptly titled album.
Streetwalking cheetah with a hat full of napalm. I'm a runaway son of the nuclear A-bomb.
James Williamson co-wrote all 8 songs with Iggy. David Bowie is credited as a co-producer. He came in at the end to mix down the album. Raw Power was, unfortunately, one of those brilliant, ahead-of-its-time albums that bombed commercially. It achieved legendary status in later years when the Sex Pistols, the Ramones, Motorhead, and Nirvana, and many other notable rockers, all cited its influence. Columbia dropped them from the label, and it wasn't long before Iggy was on his ass again. David's visit at the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute was the first time they'd spoken in nearly 2 years. Iggy was the subject of intense interest from the Institute staff. He was initially diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. The staff also determined Iggy was probably bipolar, but it was hard to tell where the drugs ended and the symptoms began. There in the psych ward at UCLA, David offered him some blow. And Iggy being Iggy, he took him up on the offer.
I'd kick it in the head when he was 25. Speed jive, don't wanna stay alive when you're 25. And when you're stealing clothes from Marks and Sparks, and Freddy's got spots from ripping off the stars from his face. Funky little boat race. The television man is...
Like we sometimes do here, let's pull back some and think about the big picture a little. We will take some care with this. We do not presume to speak for a community that is not our own. What we will do is restate and recap some things we've learned from reading, listening, and watching LGBTQ writers and creators. To the best of our ability, we're sharing their perspective. As always, we'll provide links to our sources in the show notes. 70s glam can be understood as a bold embrace of emerging queer culture. Glam successfully pushed for broader acceptance. That is a central assertion of the 1998 film Velvet Goldmine, directed by Todd Haynes. Velvet Goldmine is clearly Haynes' love letter to glam rock. We liked the movie and the soundtrack, done by Radiohead as cover band Venus and Furs. That just kills. It's the best thing about Velvet Goldmine. Anyhow, Todd Haynes identifies as gay, and he grew up in that era as a gay teenager in search of himself, so he's got credibility. This is clearly some of his lived experience, and therefore 100% valid as such. But, due respect to a great filmmaker, the sweeping conclusions made by Velvet Goldmine seem perhaps a little bit risky and overstated. David Buckingham is a media scholar and essayist who has written a lot about this. He's our source for this critique, and we'll link to his blog. For starters, writes Buckingham, none of glam's big stars were openly gay. Only David Bowie identified as bisexual, and as we discussed, he wasn't 100% on the level about that. We talked a bit about Freddie Mercury in our last chapter, and we'll talk about Elton John in a later episode. Both these superstar artists owed much to early 70s glam. They were glam adjacent, if you will. And yet both Elton and Freddie stayed in the closet all through the 70s. There were only hints and rumors. They might not have liked it, in fact they probably hated it, but they calculated that coming all the way out could damage their careers, and they were probably right about that. Finally, can we, for a moment, critically examine the supposed liberation of a straight man adopting an exaggerated, cartoonishly femme alter ego, playing dress-up to sell records and make big bucks? Again, we don't want to speak for a community that is not our own, but we're not sure that's the freedom they fought for at Stonewall.
Oh, you pretty things. Don't you know you're driving your drivers insane? Let me make it plain. Gotta make way for the Holy Superior.
So, good news and bad news. You heard the critique. Now here's the good news. Said it before and we'll say it again. Visibility matters. Representation matters. Even if these artists weren't living it authentically, they stood on a campy, flashy, queer-friendly aesthetic, bold and brash about it, no apologies. And so, what if it wasn't necessarily authentic? Authenticity is hardly the point with glam. Glam rock is meant to be a fabulous escape from this shitty, hypocritical world. A glittering fantasy universe where you become a transsexual singing space alien jamming good with Weird and Gilly. And nobody will give a shit. In fact, folks will celebrate you for it. As the calendar flipped over to the 70s, gender fluidity was the final frontier. The mere mention of it freaked out the straights and the squares. Still does, for reasons we fail to understand, but anyway, that's about as rock and roll as it gets. Moreover, gender bending to tweak square sensibilities is foundational. It goes back to one of the very first rock and rollers, Little Richard. He's in episode 2 of Rock and Roll Archaeology. Go back and listen if it's been a while. So, maybe they weren't living it exactly. Maybe the substance wasn't entirely authentic. Well, what about the style? What about the aesthetic? Both David Buckingham and our main source, Simon Reynolds, write at some length about camp, so let's unpack that term a little bit. In a 1964 essay, the brilliant writer and critic Susan Sontag brought the term camp into mainstream discourse. Sontag asserted that while some, many gay people enjoy camp, it's not an exclusive thing. Camp is a sensibility, a way of seeing the world as an aesthetic playground. It celebrates the outrageous, the exaggerated, and the artificial. Camp transforms the serious to be the frivolous, blurs the lines between high and low culture, between good and bad taste. Life is theater, and everything is in quotation marks. Now, it's hard to picture Susan Sontag vibing to Slade or T-Rex, but glam rock perfectly fits her description. Camp rock might actually be a more fitting tag for it. Maybe it didn't represent an explicit push towards recognition and equality for queer folks, but glam very loudly pushed the camp aesthetic out into the mainstream. That camp aesthetic was not exclusive to the queer community, but it was beloved by it. The association was strong. And more to the point, in a podcast about rock and roll, it was, and still is, fun. It was hot, it was crazy and sexy. It looked like a good time, because it was a good time. So maybe it was more camp than queer. Nonetheless, glam gave young people, straight or queer or still figuring it out, it gave young rock fans permission to be a little more of themselves. When we did a short about the Rocky Horror Picture Show, now there's a camp classic, anyhow, we said the film had some problematic aspects to it. But Rocky Horror also has a great message for a young person who feels like an outsider. Here's how we capsulized it. Fuck what other people think. Be yourself. Be your biggest, boldest, baddest self.
Carry the news.
Before we go back to David and Iggy riding off into the sunset, here's a little sliver of glam rock hope. Simon Reynolds writes very convincingly in Shock and Awe, when the political culture lurches right, when reactionaries try to rescind that permission to be yourself, well, glam comes right back. Comes back over and over. And if glam rock is coming back around again in these times, well, we're here for it. We could certainly use the distraction.
From station to station, back to Düsseldorf city. Meet Iggy Pop and David Bowie. Trans Europe Express. Trans Europe Express.
So, back to the LA stop on David Bowie's Isolar tour, February 11th, 1976. Now, at long last, backstage at the Forum, the author Christopher Isherwood. Yeah, remember him? Right here, Isherwood rejoins the story. David Bowie loved to paint, and he was an avid art collector. He was a lifelong fan of the celebrated artist David Hockney, who was now yet another British expat living in LA. Hockney was invited to the show on closing night. As his +1, he brought his old friend Christopher Isherwood with him. We noted earlier, David was a voracious reader. As fate would have it, he had just finished reading one of Isherwood's Berlin novels, Mr. Norris Changes Trains. After the show, at a backstage meet and greet packed with LA celebrities, David Bowie locked in on Christopher Isherwood. The two men shared a long and intense conversation. Thomas Seabrook, author of Bowie in Berlin, picks up the story.
By all accounts, Bowie and Isherwood spoke at some length. For the most part, this involved Bowie probing the writer with questions about Berlin, principally in relation to its atmosphere of decadence and artistic liberty. Berlin already sat at the top of Bowie's list of potential new homes, so it's not hard to see why he was so keen to meet the original Englishman abroad.
David had no formal education past high school, but he was quite the autodidact, supremely literate, and possessed a wide-ranging intellect, steeped in the classics, but always open to the new. In 2013, his son, Duncan Jones, curated a reading list and posted it on social media, David Bowie's 100 favorite books. Isherwood's Mr. Norris Changes Trains is on that list. So is Madame Bovary by the French neo-realist writer Gustave Flaubert. Flaubert wrote a series of essays called Rules for Artists. We don't know if David actually read them, but one of those rules seems to apply here. Be regular and orderly in your life so that you may be violent and original in your work. Sounds good, although Flaubert didn't necessarily live by that maxim. For one thing, he was very fond of prostitutes, and it's likely that he died of complications from syphilis. Be that as it may, we'll speculate that David took in that notion. He was in search of a more regular and orderly life. Berlin had a strange and sad history, and he was an unknown there. Perfect. By late 1976, when the North American leg of the Isolar tour wrapped in New York City, David Bowie was just a few months away from his 30th birthday. His 20s had been an incredible ride, but the pace was unsustainable. To survive and continue on as an artist, he needed to change things up. A new career in a new town. He would make a clean break. With Iggy Pop as his new sidekick, David sought refuge in Berlin, that divided city, straddling the Cold War's ideological split between communist East and capitalist West. Seeking anonymity, David and Iggy settled in a modest apartment in a gritty neighborhood. They were LA refugees fleeing a life of drugs and excess. They immersed themselves in the city's notorious history and forged a new path. I'm Christian Swain, and don't let me hear you say life's taking you nowhere. Thanks for listening to Rock and Archaeology on Pantheon Media. Keep up the rocking, and we'll see you soon.
Rock and Roll Archaeology is written by Richard Evans and Christian Swain. Produced and hosted by Christian Swain. All sound design and incidental music by Jerry Danielsen at Busy Signal Studios. Find all of our shows, notes, and links at pantheonpodcast.com. All songs can be found for purchase or streaming wherever you get your great music. Please pick up these amazing tracks. Contact us on social at Pantheon Podcasts on Facebook and Instagram. Tweet us at Pantheon Pods.